The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. The Radical. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Sunday afternoon. Sorry for the short delay there with the audio. Can you not hear me? Is audio still off? I hear the intro audio now. There it is. All right, everybody's on board. All right, sorry about that. The live podcasting feed, something technical problems. Got it working. All working now. I have to fix it by afterwards, but here we are. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. And we're going to be talking Jordan Peterson today. We're going to be talking Joe Rogan today. We're going to be talking about Spotify, I guess, the hot topics of the day. I will, of course, be taking Super Chat questions, anything you want to ask right here on YouTube live. For those of you listening live, I know most of you are not listening live, but those of you who are not listening live, you can still support the show. You can provide value for value. Hopefully you get a value out of listening to the show. And you can do that on yaronbrookshow.com/support, Patreon or Subscribestar. You can go over there and make a contribution. I know there are thousands of you out there who listen to the show who are not yet supporters of the show. You can also do it just in case you don't want to go to my website and click and do PayPal or whatever. You can support the show on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Locals. So lots of options on how to support the show. Of course, Super Chat is where those listening to the show live like to play. It's a lot of fun. They get to ask questions. Robert, thank you for the support. Of course, Jonathan Honing has already been here and thrown in a few dollars into the pot, as he always does, to get us rolling. And you guys can use the Super Chat. We've got a $600 goal, which is our standard goal. If you are ambitious and you'd like to make this month the best month we've ever had on the Yaron Brook Show, we'd have to go to like $2,000 a show today, but unlikely. So let's just get to the 600 like we usually do. 700 would be better. 800 would be fantastic. Anyway, Catherine is here. Catherine Mendez is here. She always is, to keep track of everything and to motivate you and to push you. Remember, $20 questions and above are preferred and get priority in terms of answering. We're going to show some clips from Jordan Peterson later on, talking about capitalism on the Joe Rogan show, and then talking about truth in the Bible. That one's a head scratcher. We'll scratch our heads together as we watch it. Capitalism is, as you'll see, really mixed, as I guess you'd expect if you've been following Jordan Peterson. But I think it's important to point out why in a sense, we can't get capitalism out there. We can't get people convinced about capitalism. We can't get the word out about capitalism because the people who have the microphone, the people who have the best shot at doing that, like Jordan, just don't know what capitalism is and don't understand and appreciate fully its value. They have this vague notion that's like, I think, most concepts for Jordan. All right. I did do a really positive thing on Jordan Peterson the other week about his resignation from the University of Toronto. So today we're going to be a little bit more negative. All right. Let's see. Where were we gonna be? Oh, I want to start though with Joe Rogan and Spotify, and of course the big movement to leave Spotify because Joe Rogan is such an evil guy. It's fascinating to watch. As you know, a few days ago, Neil Young, famous Neil Young, a musician, said basically that it's either him or Joe Rogan to Spotify. And Spotify said, okay, we'll take Jordan Peterson. And they dumped Neil Young. Since then, I understand that Joni Mitchell has given a similar ultimatum and has left Spotify, as has Barry Manilow. I haven't heard the name Barry Manilow in probably 20 years. And I expect other surviving hippies from the 1960s to drop out as well. That wasn't very nice. Joni Mitchell, I don't know, is still a hippie. But yeah, a lot of people are going to leave probably. Some people can afford it, some people can't. And Scott says Barry Manilow is a rumor. Okay, so maybe Barry Manilow hasn't left yet. That's good. But the idea is, you know, I respect them. You know, they think that Joe Rogan is doing really evil stuff. They think what he's doing is wrong. It is dangerous because he's helping spread misinformation about COVID, and they don't want to be on the same platform as him. And I think they're wrong. I mean, I think they're right about the stuff that has been on Joe Rogan's show about COVID. I think has been terrible. I think a lot of the stuff that he's brought on the show with regard to COVID, you know, the couple of doctors that he's brought on have been terrible. They're wrong. They're flawed, and it's unfortunate that Joe Rogan is being used as a tool to spread bad ideas. But I mean, bad ideas are being spread by people in the media all the time, everywhere, on all kinds of issues, many of them life or death. I'm not going to boycott a whole media platform because they carry that person or they interview that person. I mean, all media would be out. So while I would discourage Joe Rogan for interviewing Malone and some of these other, I forget the other doctor's name again, because I think they're garbage. It's his show. He can do whatever he wants. He can put anybody on. And unless Joe Rogan becomes an open advocate of communism or fascism, Nazism, racism, or you know, certain ideas that are so abhorrent that I would have nothing to do with, I would have no problem sharing a platform with him. Again, nobody's asked me, right? But look, Neil Young has his standards. I have mine. Neil Young and Joni Mitchell have every right to choose not to share a platform with Joe Rogan. That is fine. Spotify has every right in the world to prefer Joe Rogan, given the revenues he generates, over Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, who probably don't generate that much revenue. Maybe they did a long time ago, but hard to believe that they generate a lot of revenue for Spotify today, as compared to Joe Rogan. So, you know, there's a lot of huffing and puffing going on here, a lot of virtue signaling, a lot of people being super upset and super concerned. But really? You know, get a life. I think Neil Young is wrong to not want to be affiliated with Joe Rogan. I think it's stupid of him to get in such huff and puff, but he has every right to do that. I think Joe Rogan is wrong for interviewing some of the people he interviews. But generally, Joe Rogan is a thoughtful interviewer. You'll see in a minute how vehemently I disagree with him. But Joe Rogan's a good interviewer. I admire and like the fact that he has these very long format interviews. It's fantastic. And the fact that he gives a time and he allows you to actually have a conversation is amazing. I don't know if he's the first one to do this, but the first one to make it big. And of course, Lex Friedman is my guy in terms of these long format interviews that I've enjoyed being on. I wish Joe Rogan would invite me, so in spite of the fact that Joe Rogan has a lot of people on that I dislike, in spite of the fact that Joe Rogan says a lot of things that are really, really bad. You'll hear a few of them in a minute. I don't expect him to agree with me, but Joe Rogan has an amazing platform. He's created that platform. He gets every moral and financial credit for doing so. And I don't think anything he does is so abhorrent that some, leftist musicians from the 1960s, 70s should feel so threatened and feel so that he is sanctioning something so evil as to leave. So I think it's pretty pathetic of Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and all these others to leave Spotify. It's their right. I guess I respect their commitment to their ideology and commitment to not sanctioning somebody they view as evil, but I think they're wrong through and through, in spite of the fact that I agree with them on the COVID issue that Joe Rogan has brought in some real wackos to talk about COVID, and I wish he hadn't. So that's what I have to say about Rogan, Spotify, Neil Young. I'm still hoping one day to be invited on Joe Rogan's show. I don't know if that'll ever happen. We will see. We will see. It'll be interesting. Ali says Jordan Peterson talked about his friend who created a computer chip, which is the same level of human intelligence. Then he brings up the Bible to the mix. Hard for me to understand his point. Why were zero comment criticizing him? Is it a cult? We're going to show that clip, hopefully, if we get to it. We're going to show that clip and talk about it, and I'll explain to you what he means when he brings up the Bible. I don't know that my explanation will make any sense, and will be, and I think it will be true to what Jordan is trying to say, but I will explain all that to you. So stay tuned. We are going to focus on that. Also, Jordan Peterson said the Bible was the first book in Western civilization. I will talk about that as well. And I agree with you without giving it away, Ali. So I agree with you. Thanks, Ali, for those. I see one more $20 question, but let me jump into some of this video commentary that we have. We're at about $100, so about a sixth of the way there. A sixth of the way there. Hopefully, you guys have a lot of good questions about Jordan Peterson, about Joe Rogan. And now we're going to jump into capitalism. So we're going to jump into capitalism. If you have a question, I see somebody has a question about Yanis Varoufakis. If you have a question about Yanis Varoufakis or anybody else, you can use the Super Chat feature. It's very easy to use. And, you can ask a question for $2. It's just easier for me only to try. I don't always succeed at doing this, to try only taking Super Chat questions, because otherwise it's too distracting to try to follow everything that's going on. So just jump in with a Super Chat question, and I will be happy to answer it at some point during the show. All right, let's jump in with Jordan Peterson. Let me just say before we even start, what's with a bow tie? I don't get bow ties. I don't understand bow ties. I don't like them. It's like, I don't know, Murray Rothbard, I think, wore a bow tie, and then every libertarian intellectual felt like he had to wear a bow tie for a while. Maybe it comes from the conservatives. Conservatives also. Every time I see somebody with a suit and a bow tie, I'm like, okay, it's an anarcho-capitalist or an old-time Buckley, snobby conservative. It's not a good look. It's not a good look. And it doesn't fit Jordan. I don't know. That's just my opinion. Yeah, I know it's a tuxedo. Why do you go on Joe Rogan with a tuxedo? Is he going to like a formal afterwards? I mean, this is like a 4-hour show. Why would you dress in like the most uncomfortable dress that one can imagine to go for a 4-hour show with somebody, right? I don't wear them for the orchestra. I have worn, okay, so here's a secret. Since somebody told me you guys like to hear a little bit about me personally, I've worn a tuxedo exactly once in my life. Once in my entire life, when I was best man at my best friend's wedding. I didn't wear a suit at my wedding. I didn't wear a tie at my wedding. I've only worn a tuxedo that once. I rented it. I do not go to concerts with it. Concerts, I'm going to sit there for 2 hours listening to music. I want to feel comfortable. I do not feel comfortable in the suit and tie. I have not worn a tie. Well, with COVID, probably in 3 years. I'm trying never to wear a tie again. That is one of my goals in life. I did not wear a tie at my bar mitzvah. I'm pretty sure I didn't wear a tie in my bar mitzvah. Yeah, I mean, God, this is short sleeve shirt. I go to business meetings. I wear a jacket and a nice shirt, long sleeve shirt, not short sleeve shirt. And I find ties strangle me. I don't like it. I don't like the look. There's something about a tucker. Carlson used to wear a bow tie when he was a Buckley libertarian leaning type conservative. It was kind of the uniform. That's what you wore. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe he's going somewhere after Joe Rogan and he's multitasking. But he's wearing a tuxedo in Austin, Texas. Where the hell is he going in Austin, Texas, where a tuxedo is what you wear? I don't know. I have no idea. Doesn't make sense to me. It's not my thing. I see bow ties. I kind of cringe. But that's just me. That's my personal reaction. So sorry, Jordan. Nothing personal. Lex Friedman wears a black tie, white shirt, black jacket, black suit to every episode of the show, almost every episode of the show. I could never do my shows wearing a tie. But Lex is like 1.4 million people subscribing, so maybe I should wear a tie. Maybe if I wore a tie, if I wore a tie, I'd have, maybe next show I'll wear a tie and see if we get more viewership. If viewership goes up after I wear a tie. Our web says I should chill. All right, here we go. This is Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan talking about capitalism from, I think, the long interview. Now, I don't have access to the long one because it's on Spotify and I don't have a Spotify subscription. I've taken this from clips I found. This is a clip that somebody put up on YouTube, so I'm using their clip to show this. Feel free. There's stuff before this. There's obviously stuff after this. This is the segment somebody put up, and there's advertising for that website on here. So. Here we go. And I'll probably stop this every 2 seconds because I'm not going to be happy with this one. All right.
So Marx observed that money tends to aggregate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Okay.
That's true. It's one of the observations Marx makes. Well, not observations. It's actually not an observation Marx makes. It's a prediction Marx makes. Marx makes the prediction. The money under capitalism would aggregate in fewer and fewer and fewer people. And indeed, one of the predictions he makes is that capitalism will collapse. And why communism will arise in capitalist countries, Great Britain, Germany being, particularly Great Britain, being the places where he most expected communism to arise. As this massive wealth gap expands, all the wealth is going to the very, very wealthy, and the proletarian rebel against that. But all the wealth is slowly aggregating. This was Marx's prediction. Not that he was seeing that, but that's what he was predicting was going to happen in the future.
Okay, the first question is that true? And the answer is, not only is that true, it's so true that you can model the distribution of money in a population using equations derived from physics.
Now, none of that is true. It is indeed complete nonsense. It is absolutely untrue. And if you understood diminishing, the fact that there are diminishing returns on capital, if you understood how competition works, if you understood what capitalism was and how it worked, how could you say something like that? It's just not true. Now, it's true that some people get more than others. Absolutely. That inequality is a feature of capitalism, not a bug. But the idea that this gets worse and worse and worse and worse is complete and utter worse is the wrong word, more and more and more of this happens, is just completely wrong. And it's been shown wrong over and over and over again. Indeed, what causes the great aggregation of wealth in the hands for this to get, in a sense, greater and greater and greater and never stop, is statism, is government involvement, is government protection of those who accumulate the wealth. But in a market economy, I mean, the beauty is that people become rich, they lose their money, or they lose their money within a generation or two. It's very hard to keep making huge rates of return. You can't just take Amazon's or Apple's return on investment from the last 20 years and just extrapolate that into the future. It never happens. Returns tend to moderate and come down. This gap, this supposed gap that exists between the rich and the poor, there is no mathematical formula that determines how big that'll be, how small that'll be, whether it'll continue to expand, will shrink. There'll always be a gap. Inequality is a feature of capitalism, not a bug, as I've told you many times. But the idea that you can model this with equations out of physics is complete nonsense. Indeed, economics as a science has gone downhill and become a disaster, a complete and utter disaster, because it has turned to mathematics as its savior, because people try to model this behavior in terms of mathematics, but it doesn't work. It's too complex, and it includes a factor that you can't model mathematically. What is the factor that economics includes that you cannot model mathematically? Huh? What is it? Well, that factor is human behavior, free will, innovation, ingenuity, reason. You can't model those. You can't model those. Indeed, that's why nobody predicted the Industrial Revolution was happening. And in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, nobody knew that it was going to continue and how it was going to continue. And nobody knows today exactly the path of innovation into the future. And nobody knows how long the billionaires are going to stay billionaires, and who the new billionaires are going to be, and how rich we're all going to become. I think I gave you once this example. If the economy grows at 5% real rates of return for the next 40 years, pretty much everybody becomes a millionaire. Everybody. That's how rich we all become in real terms. You can't, there's no, I can model that if I make some assumptions, but the assumptions are just plain vanilla. They're not assumptions about the gap, and certainly not equations from physics. Which equation from physics exactly? He'll never tell us that. Is it quantum mechanics? Is it Einstein's relativity? Is it Newton's mechanics? What equations from physics? I studied finance and took classes in very advanced mathematical modeling of finance, can tell you it doesn't work. And indeed, when you try to do too much mathematics in finance, for example, what you get are models that tell you the mortgage-backed securities on, the lowest tranche can never fail. And then you get a financial crisis and you discover, whoops, reality doesn't quite fit my models. What's up with that? As Nassim Taleb, for one, has explained quite eloquently, or not so eloquently sometimes, but as illustrated, economics markets cannot be modeled by equations from physics because human beings are involved. I wonder if what Jordan Peterson would think if I said psychiatry could be modeled on equations. Physics. We don't need psychiatrists. We just bring physicists into the room. And now, find an equation that fits you. It's just silliness that comes from, a certain intrinsicist view of the world that he has, and a real fundamental, negation. Well, he doesn't understand economics. We'll get to that. But a real negation of ultimately free will.
It's really unbelievably true. But then
No, it's not unbelievably true at all.
Marx said, that's capitalism. That is not true. And it's actually an underestimation of the problem, because if the problem of inequality, which is an actual problem.
Why is inequality a problem? He'll never say why it's a problem. I've seen him, he's talked about it in other places. Even when we had our brief discussion, he mentions inequality of a problem. Inequality is not a problem. There's no problem of inequality. Now, his view is it's not a problem of capitalism, because it's a problem of all human existence. It's a problem of life. It's a problem of every single system. It's a problem of communism. It's a problem of every system has built into this tendency towards inequality and accumulation of wealth, all in the hands of a few.
Was as simple as, let's change capitalism. Well, yeah, let's change capitalism.
Really?
Unfortunately, the problem is so deep that changing capitalism won't change the problem at all.
See, this is one of my big disagreements with Jordan around economics and society. I don't believe inequality is a problem. It might be a psychological problem. It might ultimately be a political problem in the world we live in today. It's zero economic problem, and it's only a political and psychological problem because we live in an altruistic world, because we keep being told it's a problem. We keep being pointed out that it's a problem. We keep reinforcing the idea that it should be a problem. In other words, we live in a society that encourages envy. And that is a problem.
And in fact, in most of the places where it's been attempted, especially the more radical forms of communism, let's say, rather than socialism, because we can distinguish the two, and it's important to do so. In countries that became communist, it wasn't like a small percentage of the people still didn't own all the resources. It's just that there were hardly any resources, and almost everyone had nothing. There was still a tiny fraction of people who were the privileged elite. And so,
yeah, but you see, this is dangerous. Words mean something. It is simply not true that a small minority owned all the resources. I mean, that is way too benevolent towards communism. Nobody owned anything, and indeed, even with those small minority, at any point in time, that could be taken away from them like that. It is that all decision-making about every aspect of life was controlled by a small group of people. And they didn't own anything. Ownership, it doesn't mean anything under communism. They controlled, and they made all the decisions. And that's a meaningful distinction to say, a small group of people owned a lot of the stuff. In communism, but there wasn't a lot of stuff. In capitalism, a small group of people owns all the stuff, but there's a lot of stuff. Wow, that is focusing on the wrong thing about the difference between communism and capitalism. The fundamental difference is freedom, choice, decision-making. Who makes the decisions? Don't worry, he's not going to talk about lobsters. But for him, everything is about hierarchies. And what's important about human beings is hierarchies. And to me, while it's true, we're all different, and there's a sense in which that falls under hierarchies, I don't think of it as hierarchies. I don't think of somebody richer than me as somebody is a lobster that's stepping on me. See, lobsters live in a zero-sum world. Animals live in a zero-sum world. What you eat, I can't eat. But when I look at a billionaire, I see somebody who's made my life better. I see somebody who's raised me up, who's improved my life. Because economics is not the jungle. It's not the aquarium. Economics is a system of trade under freedom in which people are better off because of other people's success, not worse off, at least under capitalism. So the whole way in which Jordan looks at this is off. It's often, it plays into the enemies of capitalism. And it has no moral grounding. He can't morally ground it in any kind of way. I'm using lobsters because that's what Jordan always uses, the idea that lobsters step on one another to get out. But lobsters are indeed yummy, as you guys are saying on the chat.
So, if you play Monopoly, what happens when you
here
play
it goes
Monopoly?
again.
Everybody
gets all the
starts
money.
out equal, and one, exactly. And so you can actually model this problem with something as simple as a Monopoly game. That's actually a fairly good model of how money distributes itself in the environment.
This is so terrible. It's so terrible. Monopoly is again a zero-sum world. Monopoly, there's no innovation. There's no entrepreneurship. I mean, you can build houses. It's built on luck. It's flipping a coin. There's no ability. But in Monopoly, it's obvious that my success comes at your expense. You don't benefit at all from me succeeding in Monopoly. I played a lot of Monopoly in my life. And the whole point of Monopoly is to crush everybody else on the board. That is not what capitalism is about. And indeed, Monopoly is an anti-capitalist game. And this plays right into the hands of the socialist. This plays right into the hand of the bad guys. Nobody's going to beat me in Monopoly. And by the way, if somebody wants to know how I used to play Monopoly, my innovation on the game Monopoly to make it more capitalist, to make it significantly more capitalist, and to make it more interesting, and to make it more fun as a game, that'll cost you $20. But if anybody wants to put $20 in, I will tell you how to dramatically improve the board game of Monopoly. Simple, very simple way of doing it. Doesn't require any additional parts, but I mean, this is awful. And he gets worse because he goes from Monopoly to what?
And you can blame that on capitalism, but you can get exactly the same result if you have people trade because they flip a dice. So if you took 100 people, let's say give 100 people $10 each, and then they had to trade with each other. If you flip a coin and I flip a coin, and if we flip a coin, if it's heads, you get $1. And so that's your game. Heads gives you $1. If you play that out till it concludes, what happens is some people lose, let's say they have $10. They lose 10 times in a row. Well, then what happens? At zero. Well, they can't trade anymore. So what happens is that people lose at different rates, but if you lose enough, even if it takes you 100 trades to lose all your money, as soon as you hit zero, you're done. If you play that out to its conclusion, even though it's random, completely random, the trading, one person ends up with all the money and everyone else ends up with zero. And so I'm a member of a nation.
I mean, this is terrible. I can't tell you how terrible this is. It's really, really bad. Because this plays into every anti-capitalist idea that's out there. Capitalism is just flipping coins. The distribution of wealth is not determined by ability. It's not determined by production. It's not determined by ingenuity or applying reason to a problem. It doesn't enhance the world. It doesn't enhance other people. It's a zero-sum world. And therefore, if it's a zero-sum world and it's all based on luck, then why is it wrong to redistribute wealth? Why is it wrong to regulate people? Why is it wrong to control people? But the whole essence of trade, the whole essential aspect of trade, is that trade is a win-win relationship. It's a win-win transaction. Both parties are better off. That doesn't exist in monopoly. And that doesn't exist in flipping a coin. And by giving up on the most important feature of capitalism, which is entrepreneurship and trade, production and trade. That's the most, from an economic perspective. I'm not even talking about the philosophy, the morality, and the politics of capitalism. Just from an economics perspective, the two important features about capitalism are production and trade. And yet, for Jordan, they don't exist. There's just an algorithm out there, flipping coins, people getting money, and he can predict how the money will be distributed at the end of the game. And how did new money show up? How did new wealth appear? Where did that come from? And who gets that? What's the physics formula to allocate that? I mean, it's hard for me to express how frustrated I am at this, because millions of people are going to watch it. Millions of people are going to watch it. And it's just wrong. And he is portrayed out there as a defender of markets, as a defender of capitalism. And later on, he'll say how wonderful markets are. But he's just given this, which has undermined everything he says later on. People think of him. He's got the millions of followers. All right, let's see. Let's keep going here. We'll get to Joe Rogan, and you'll see what Joe Rogan has to say about the world. Oh my God. God. It's so frustrating. It's so frustrating. And I understand why he won't have me on the show, given what he says about economics.
Native Canadian family, West Coast Indian family, Native family. And
Listen to this.
This particular culture had a tradition, potlatch, and they had the same problem in their culture. And the problem was that some of the big chiefs over some period of time would end up with like all the stuff, all of it. And that.
But how did they end up with all this stuff? And again, if you don't differentiate with capitalism, then people assume that this is the same way the capitalists get all this stuff. The chiefs got all the stuff because they had the political power to take all the stuff. The chiefs got all the stuff because they confiscated all the stuff. They stole all the stuff. They took all the stuff. They didn't trade for all the stuff. It's not that this chiefdom was some free market where the chiefs landed up with all the stuff. It's a zero-sum world in which they had the gun, political power, and took it all. And he's saying this is just like capitalism. This is what happens. All these systems are the same. And he's ignoring the fundamental, principled difference between them, and thus undermining and undercutting any support he might provide capitalism later on.
That wasn't good because, well, for obvious reasons, you know, it would destabilize the society. That's in some sense, the least of the problem. And so they evolved this mechanism. They'd have these big celebrations that rich people would put on where status was determined by how much of that wealth you would give away. Right. And that was the potlatch. Yeah, they had to do it. And back in now,
well, that's philanthropy, right? Like
right.
People really looked very highly, very wealth engaged.
Yeah, well, and I haven't, this might be a biased sound.
So the whole idea of philanthropy is you've stolen all the stuff from all the people, and you give some of it back, and to appease them so they don't rebel against you, so they don't slaughter you. And philanthropy in the modern time is the same way. You know, you accumulate a lot of money for no reason. I don't know how much Joe Rogan has earned, but obviously it's all been luck and so on. God, I mean, these are wealthy people. Both Jordan and Joe Rogan have earned a lot of money through their own skill and talent and entrepreneurial capabilities, and yet this is the level at which they understand. And then philanthropy is just done in order to appease the people so they don't rebel against these rich guys who've taken all the stuff. And this is just how society is supposed to function. This is the model, you know.
But I don't think so. And if it is, it's biased towards entrepreneur conservative types who you would think in the parity sense would be the least likely to do this. I haven't met anyone who has a vast fortune whose primary concern isn't what the hell can I do with all this money that's beneficial as fast as possible. They're not sitting around thinking I need another super yacht. And now look, there's going to be people like that, you know, but I haven't met any of them.
Have you met Jeff Bezos?
No, I haven't. I haven't met Bezos.
What has Joe Rogan got against Bezos? God.
But as
I bet he's got a couple.
I'm sure he does. But like, I'm pretty happy about the fact that he's building rocket ship.
Good for Jordan Peterson. You see, once in a while he says something and you go, yes. I'm pretty happy he's building, you know, spacecraft as well. And you need billions.
And that
for that
actually takes a lot of capital.
Yeah, it does.
You know, and the other thing there's a couple of other things about capitalism that are worth thinking about. One is...
He hasn't said anything about capitalism until now, by the way. Not a word about capitalism until now. But there's another thing. You see, he's talked about all these other systems. Communism, tribalism, all systems of force and coercion. All systems of zero-sum economics. And now he's saying there's another thing about capitalism. So what he's saying is everything I've said before is capitalism. Ugh. So angry.
All the evidence suggests that relatively free markets are the best way to make the absolutely poor richer. That's
So relatively few markets. Why? Yes, I mean, maybe absolutely free markets would make them even richer.
not an inequality issue. It's
But notice that what's good about capitalism is helping the poor.
just that while they're not starving, and that's something, we've lifted more people out of poverty in the last 15 years than in the entire course of human history.
Can I pause you for a second there?
Yep.
Okay, now we're going to get a Joe Rogan rant. Brace yourselves. Brace yourselves, because, you remember Joe Rogan at some point during the campaign supported Bernie Sanders. So, this is his Bernie Sanders take on economics. It's about at the level of economic understanding that Bernie has.
One point that I forgot. I read this the other day, that where Karl Marx is buried, they have to charge money because they have to maintain it. And they
Very
need money
funny.
to maintain it, which
Yeah.
make sure that's true.
Yeah.
Because it's hilarious. I read that and it was like, and I was like, is that real?
My daughter
Because that
once
is kind of funny.
My daughter once bought me a 50% off Karl Marx doll, which I thought was just ridiculous, and she bought it for that reason.
That's
she told me
adorable.
it's so funny. It was
Now,
so funny.
capitalism.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Here's when people start talking about capitalism, and we talk about capitalism uplifting poor people. One of the issues that a lot of people have in this country is when you ship jobs overseas and you ship companies start manufacturing things over for essentially pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like it's one of the great contradictions
Right.
to the progressives in America, that they complain about capitalism on a fucking iPhone. Because if
Right.
you knew where that iPhone was, if you went down to the factory where that iPhone was manufactured, you'd be heartbroken. If you went further to where the minerals are dug out of the ground in the Congo, you'd
Now let me just say, I'll stop him here. I could comment on everything he's going to say, but God, you would not be heartbroken if you went to where they manufacture the iPhones. Indeed, you'd be heartened if you had a heart. And people who've actually done it, rather than just sit at home comfortably in wealth and complain about these things. If you actually went to the factory in China and then went, talked to the workers, and actually then went to the place where the worker came from, maybe the little village in rural China where they grew up, and saw the life they lived there, you would be heartened by the fact that the workers in the factories of making the iPhones in China, whose lives are significantly better off than what they used to be, and are going to be significantly better off in 10, 20 years if they're allowed to, because of constraints and freedom that are coming in China. Significantly better off. They're on a path to success. They're on a path to prosperity. They're on a path to not starving. They're on a path to economic independence. As individuals, forget China, forget that you hate China, forget that it's fascist, just at the individual level. It's just not true. But you see, when people like Joe Rogan say it over and over and over again, and the left says it over and over again, and economics professors say it over and over again, and moralists say it over and over again, and they all say it over and over again, then we start believing it. There's a great TED Talk, which I recommend. God, I don't remember her name. She's an Asian correspondent for NPR. So a typical leftist NPR correspondent who spent a lot of time in China, who lived in China, and reported from the factories, and went to the factories, and talked to the women who worked in the factories, and wrote about it, and did a TED Talk about it, and wrote a book about it. And she shows how much these factories have benefited and improved the lives of these Chinese, and how evil it is to sit back at home and condemn this. And as a consequence of that, ultimately, if people follow this condemnation, you're basically condemning these people to poverty for the rest of their lives. They have to go backwards. There is documentation after documentation after documentation after documentation. Sweatshops are good for the people who are there. And they disappear, not because of your activism, but because they gain skills, they increase in productivity, and their wages go up. Now, I'm not justifying slavery, evil. I'm not justifying whipping people and chaining them to machines, any of that. But in terms of wages, voluntary transactions, switch-ups have been proven time and time again to be hugely beneficial because they train people, they give them skills, and the reason they take the jobs is because the job is a better alternative than what they have, and they get wealthier from the job. Their wages go up over time, and ultimately switch-ups disappeared. Even in China today, a lot of the very, very most lowest paid activities are no longer done in China because China, the productivity of labor has gone up so much that you'd have to pay them a lot of money to do the work.
Be devastated. Like, that's the reality of capitalism. That's the reality of sending jobs overseas. The cure to that is a more even distribution of wealth within the company, meaning that the company would have to, and I'm not picking on Apple, like any company,
Notice this solution.
they would have to pay the people that work there a decent living wage with great benefits and health insurance and dental and all the stuff that people want and need in order to feel secure and safe. Give them a great working environment, don't overwork them. And now how much money? Because the amount of money that Apple has put aside, and obviously I'm an Apple fan. I have an Apple phone right here. I'm not picking on that. But they are one of the richest companies that's ever existed on the face of planet Earth. But how are they doing that? One of the ways they're doing that is by paying people very little to make their products that they sell for a giant amount of money.
Yeah.
So
That is unbelievably ridiculous. I mean, it just really is. You know, the contribution of labor in terms of assembling these iPhones is what allows Apple to make a fortune. And what would happen if Apple started paying all its workers much higher wages? Much higher wages. What would happen if that was the case? I mean, they would have to charge a lot more for the iPhones and sell a lot less of those iPhones. And because they sold less of those iPhones, what would happen to the number of jobs that were available to assemble those iPhones? It would decline. A lot of those people would go out of business. Whenever you pay people artificially high wages, whenever you pay people more than they are productive, what happens? You lose money on those employees, and therefore you get rid of them. Now, we'll get to John Ford, the Ford example, where Ford basically doubled wages of everybody at the Ford plant some year. But what Ford did when he doubled those wages, by doubling those wages, he attracted the most productive workers in the car industry. And he laid off the people who couldn't produce at $5 an hour. I can't remember what the number was, $5 a day, probably a day in those days. So what he did by increasing the wages was not just randomly increase wages, but increase wages for the most productive and expected them to live up to that productivity. And he said he wanted to pay them so they could buy their own car, but that's not why he did it. You know, Jordan Peterson will talk about this. That's not how he did it. Why he did it. Jordan will say it is, but it's not. He did it because he wanted to attract the best, most productive people to work at his factory. He wanted to be able to expect and demand from them extraordinary productive ability. I mean, the number of them who could buy the car would not make a dent in how wealthy Ford would be, would not make a dent in the sales of Ford. He did it because it was his rational interest. He did it because it was going to raise profitability. He did it, by the way, because he was a master, and this is what made Ford so amazing. It was a master at increasing the productivity of labor. That's what the assembly line is all about. The assembly line is a way to get more productivity out of the people that you have. And as a consequence, you can pay them more because they become more productive. So, I mean, Joe is completely ignorant of economics, and somewhat understandable. I mean, he's not an intellectual. He's an interviewer. His background is not in economics.
So what's the solution to that?
Okay, well,
Is the solution to pay people a fair amount? And if you do that, is the solution to pay people a fair amount in another country?
What is a fair amount, and what constitutes a fair amount? Would you pay the Chinese people the same amount as you pay in the U.S.? This is the thing they don't understand, too. And this is, why do the Chinese make less money than Americans? Even when you adjust for cost of living. Why do they make less? They make less because they're less productive. They're less productive because they're less educated. They're less productive because, the tools and machines maybe that they use are not quite as good. And indeed, it's expensive for Apple to make iPhones in China. Why is it expensive? Because you have to ship those iPhones all the way to Americans, Europe, to their markets, which is expensive. So if Apple paid workers in China what Joe Rogan considers a fair wage, and I don't think that he has a clue what fairness means in this context, they'd be way overpaid in a sense of how productive they are. You measure productivity by how many units come out on the other side, how much input there is versus how many units come out the other side.
Or is the solution to pay people a fair amount here where we can regulate? Because we do manufacture some things here, but we manufacture way less.
We don't. I've already talked about this fallacy. Again, this is one of those talking points that you say over and over and over and over and over and over again, and people believe it. But we don't manufacture less today in the United States. We manufacture more than we've ever manufactured in American history. We just manufacture it using robots and computers. We manufacture it with a lot less people, half the number of people. But we manufacture many, many more things today than we did in the past. So this is just, again, one of those ridiculous fallacies that I wish Joe Rogan would have me on the show so I can tell him, Joe, you're wrong. That's just not true. It's just not true, factually. You can Google it. He likes Googling stuff. You can Google it.
Than we used to because it costs too much money to do so.
None of that is true.
Word too much or that phrase too much is bullshit. It's not that it costs too much. It's just that it costs more and they don't want to pay it. They would rather just reap in profits, and the way they do that is on the backs of poor people.
None of that is true. None of that is true. On the backs of poor people. As Jordan Peterson said, what Apple has done is allow poor people to rise out of poverty. It's the exact opposite.
Now, if you do that on the backs of poor people,
we could take that apart a bit.
Right.
And so,
but here's my question. If you really wanted to make these other countries, like third world countries, and raise them up and really increase the economy, what you would do is pay people in third world countries where you have these plants the same amount.
But then you couldn't afford to
pay them in America.
Then you wouldn't sell any products and you'd have to fire them all.
In those environments.
Okay, so we can take that apart a bunch of ways. I mean, part of the advantage to manufacturing things where wages are relatively low is you give those countries a competitive advantage. So part of the reason...
That is huge. That's absolutely right. You're giving those countries a comparative advantage. Not absolute advantage, but comparative advantage. And that's division of labor, and that's hugely important. This is what Adam Smith talked about 1776, right? Long time ago.
Reason that there aren't millions of people starving in China, because even the Chinese communists woke up enough to realize that if they opened up their economies, that free market is nothing different than allowing unrestricted choice among consumers in some sense.
That's wrong. Free market is about allowing unrestricted choice among producers. It's not about consumption. I just did a show on wealth where I talked about this much more, but it's not about unrestricted choices among consumers. Because the only way consumers can have the money to pay for all the things, for all these unrestricted choices that they have, is if they produce. And the only way they can produce is if entrepreneurs create businesses where they can produce. So capitalism in this context is where you allow for unrestricted production, not consumption. Production. So even when I'm agreeing with him in the sense that he's going to defend free markets here, it's exacerbating, is that the right word? Just because the way he does it is just so wrong and it plays into the hands of our enemies.
When we're talking about the free market, careful about what we're talking. You get to have choice about what you buy.
You get to have choice about what you produce and what you trade. Capitalism, free markets, put aside capitalism, free markets about trade and production. Production first, then trade. Exasperating. That's what I meant to say, exasperating. Is that right? I don't know. Anyway, you guys get what I'm saying. It's just frustrating. Free markets about producing and trading freely.
It's the central spirit of free market capitalism. Exporting those jobs stopped the Chinese, a huge proportion of the Chinese, from living in absolute privation and likely decreased the probability of like a broad-scale war. So
the real reason, this is just, the real reason it's good that China has become freer, more capitalist, is because it stopped large-scale war. And while this might be true, I doubt it, very much doubt it, because a poor China could not have taken on the United States in the large-scale war. And Mao Zedong China had no chance against the United States. You're going to justify exporting jobs from America to China in the name of peace? Really? No, we'll hear nothing about the real benefits to America from Chinese production.
Oh, and it also brought the Chinese into the economy, which is a big deal. The Chinese produce more engineers every year than the Americans have engineers.
That's true, and one of the reasons jobs move to China has nothing to do with the low cost of labor and everything to do with the availability of engineers. If you want to start a new business and you need to hire 1,000 engineers tomorrow, you can't find them in America. They just don't exist. We don't have enough. We don't produce enough. But in China, you can hire 1,000 engineers like that. And that's the great advantage of going to China. Same with India. India has a lot of engineers.
We've unlocked an unbelievable amount of brain power, and that's produced an insane technological revolution. Now, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of that was done on the backs of the American working class. And I think that the Democrats abandoning the working class when they were in that state of privation was a catastrophe of public policy, and also part of the reason why Trump got elected.
So here's another one of these fallacies that I don't know how you get rid of this fallacy. You know, I'm not going to get a lot done on today's show. It looks like I'm not even sure I'm going to get to your super chat questions. Given the pace I'm going, I don't know, because I've got dinner at 5, so we're somewhat limited. And I'm, we're only halfway through this video. This is another one of these fallacies. It's just not true that this was done on the backs of the American working class. The American working class is the biggest beneficiary of trade with China. It has lowered the cost of living for the working class dramatically. The working class are the people who shop at Walmart. Walmart has benefited massively the working class. It's made it possible for them to buy things cheaper and therefore raise their standard of living. And it is a fact that the American working class has iPhones. How is that measured? How do you measure the benefit that that has had on their lives? They have computers, they have the internet. All the advances that are happening around, that yes, the billionaires became billionaires because of, are beneficial to the working class. And China producing this stuff and making it cheap and delivering it to the United States so efficiently and productively and cheaply is beneficial to the American working class. And even if you look at wages, if you adjust for changes in households, in the size of households generally over the last 40 years have gotten smaller. So when you take household income, you're now dividing it across fewer people, have gotten wealthier. It is wrong. It is just wrong to say that household income per capita in America has gone down for the working class over the last 40 years. It's just not economically, scientifically, empirically true. But they buy into all this leftist Thomas Piketty nonsense without challenging it. And then they're stuck. Then they find all kinds of ways to justify it. And then again, on top of that, to the extent that the U.S. economy is not growing fast enough, to the extent that American workers are not being paid enough, to the extent that wages should be higher, to the extent that we all should be richer, the reason for all of that is government intervention. The reason for all of that is a lack of capitalism. The reason for all of that is the regulatory state and the taxing state. So again, Iran being frustrated at Jordan and Joe, who millions and millions of people are going to watch. And somebody says, you know, not everybody agrees with everything Joe Rogan says. I know that. But when you hear people say the same thing over and over again, when Joe Rogan is so conventional in so many of these things, that starts becoming culturally acceptable. It's part of the culture. It's part of everything out there. Nobody challenges it. And Joe does not. Once in a while, he'll have a free market economist on there, he said. But I wish he would have more people who challenge this part of his belief system. I think that would be very good. And Jordan, unfortunately, is not up to the challenge of challenging him on these issues.
It isn't obvious to me that exporting those jobs was a bad long-term decision, because...
Good for you, Jordan Peterson. But it's not, we don't export jobs. Jobs aren't exported. That whole way of thinking about it is wrong.
Well, you want a world where 20 million Chinese are starving?
What about the fact that America is richer and better off because we so-called, quote, exported the jobs? Why are we making this all about the Chinese? Why aren't we making it about Americans? Why are we making clear, as Adam Smith did, that free markets and free trade and free movement of labor, or free division of labor, is good for everybody. It's win-win. Americans win when the Chinese win. It's not monopoly. It's not a zero-sum world. And it's not all about preventing the Chinese from going to war any more than charity is about keeping those poor people happy so they don't come and kill all the billionaires. He's got this mentality of everything's conflict, lobsters stepping on one another. Ultimately, it's all a zero-sum world.
That's not good by any measure, right?
But is that the only way that they don't starve? The only way they don't starve is if iPhones are manufactured
it's the only
there
way
for
they
pennies
don't
on the
starve.
dollar?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Well, no other solutions ever work.
But that doesn't mean they can't work. If they
it
work
might.
in America, it might?
Well,
really?
I don't know, Joe, because that's a good question, you know, but for me, the problem with utopian theories is that they're hypothetical. So I like to look at what's actually worked, and what's clearly worked is...
Yeah, but what you have to do is look at what actually worked, look what clearly worked, abstract away and see if you can improve on that. And when you see somewhat free markets working, you can abstract away from that and come up with let's call it a utopian vision, a real capitalism, pure capitalism, and how that would work and how wonderfully that would work.
Is the introduction of free market principles into poor
That's
countries.
true.
So, for example, in Africa has the fastest growing economies in the world.
This is true.
Particularly sub-Saharan Africa. That's really something. And some of those countries are really getting on a reasonably solid footing.
Yep.
And almost all that's happened since the Berlin Wall fell. And part of the reason for that is that continent isn't being riven by a terrible conflict between the communists and the capitalists.
It's part of
And
it.
most of the reason the eradication of that conflict has been beneficial is because they're not doing unbelievably stupid and counterproductive things at the policy level. You're letting markets flourish to at least a limited degree. And that's...
Yeah, they're allowing private property and they're allowing markets in Africa, some parts of Africa. And that's a huge benefit.
People aren't, you know, I talked to some people. I was in Washington for a week last week, and I talked to some people who are working with UN committee that's prime goal is the eradication of hunger. Well, there isn't any hunger in the world anymore that isn't caused by political conflict.
That is absolutely
Everyone
true.
has enough to eat. In fact, it's so interesting that one of the emerging problems, especially among the poor all over the world, is that They have too much to eat. And so we're seeing diseases of affluence replace diseases of privation.
Absolutely true.
And you think, isn't that too bad, these Western diets? And, fair enough, but you want to be fat or dead? And fat's better. And fat isn't optimal, let's say, but it beats the hell out of dead.
Well, how many people starve to death
now
in the world? Yeah.
Almost none.
Almost nobody.
And
Let's look that
almost
up.
all,
absolutely
almost
right.
all those
Almost
who
nobody.
do
Yeah.
it because of political conflict. Like it's purposeful starvation.
He's
So
absolutely
someone
right.
has put a blockade on ships and goods.
to starve them.
To starve
Right,
them.
as a political weapon. Yeah.
When you're talking about the prosperous areas that have prospered because they brought in the market, and these companies have shipped these jobs over to these places and allowed these people to flourish. The flip side is Detroit.
Right.
Detroit was one of the wealthiest cities in this country, and hence one of the wealthiest cities
True.
in the world just a few decades ago. It wasn't that long ago. When they were in the height of their manufacturing, all of the American automobiles were made in Detroit. Cadillacs and Chevys and Fords, and that was where everybody worked. And then it was also where the union auto workers had established a strong foothold, and they made good money.
You
the
bet.
people got paid a great wage, and everyone who worked in those places, they had a good lifestyle.
Well, Henry Ford.
And what destroyed Detroit? What destroyed Detroit? Was it China that destroyed Detroit? Or maybe it was the unions that destroyed Detroit. Maybe it was the fact that the unions were sucking the car companies for everything they could. Maybe it was the fact that productivity among American auto workers declined significantly, even dramatically. Maybe it's the fact that Detroit became heavily regulated, heavily statist, heavily taxed, heavily zoned, heavily controlled. Maybe it's the fact that the left took over Detroit. Maybe it's the fact that at some point in Detroit they stopped policing. I read about this at some point when I was researching Detroit. Detroit, and all of that, I'd say primarily the unions, made Detroit less competitive versus the rest of the world. Before we shipped jobs overseas, Detroit became uncompetitive when the Japanese and the Germans rebuilt their manufacturing capabilities and started producing better cars than Detroit did. Why couldn't Detroit produce good cars? Because of the unions, because they were overpaying, because they didn't automate fast enough, because of all the benefits they were forced through regulations to pay and all the regulatory stuff that has to do with it. So it's not true that Detroit, was this wonderful place. And unions were super productive and super efficient and great. No, the unions were sucking the rest of America dry because they were getting more than market wages. Now, where does that money come from? If the unions are making more than market wages, more than their productivity justifies, where does that come from? Not profitability of Ford. Where does it come from? This is, again, the misunderstanding about how profits work. It comes from all of our pockets. It comes from the fact that automobiles are more expensive. It means that all of us have not as good automobiles. We have less money to spend. If we buy an automobile, we have less money to spend on other things, which means our quality of life and our standard of living drops when unions keep wages artificially high. Let me be very clear about this. Artificially high wages, which unions generate, is a drag on the quality and standard of living on the rest of Americans. In that sense, union workers, particularly in Detroit, in the auto industry, historically have been leeches on the rest of America. So you shouldn't hold up Detroit as this model, unless you mean Detroit of the early 20th century, pre-World War II, when Detroit really had competition, when Detroit where the unions were young and worked with management in order to create a productive, wealth-enhancing workplace, before unions were politicized, before unions got the kind of power where they could dictate, before the entire system got corrupted, and by the 60s, late 60s and 70s, Detroit was a disaster. And it was just a matter of time before it would fold, and that's way before the Chinese entered the equation, way before you could argue we exported jobs out of the country. It's just exporting jobs out of the country, you could argue happened in the 90s and 2000s. Maybe started in the 80s, but even not then. And most of the jobs lost in Detroit were not jobs lost to China. The jobs lost to Detroit were lost to Silicon Valley. It amazes me that people complain about the working class in America, and yet wages have been going up the last few years for the working class faster than anybody else. But it's not just wages. Unemployment has been super low. Super low. Lower than what economists used to consider the natural rate of unemployment, which I always thought was a bogus concept. Natural rate of unemployment. All right, I'm just going to give a quick, before we continue, just because we've got a lot of people online, maybe some new people here. You're listening to Yaron Brook Show. One of the ways you can support the Yaron Brook Show if you're listening live is through the Super Chat. You can make a contribution, value for value. I offer all this free, but it's great to see people respond by contributing to what I do. You can do so on the Super Chat. We're about $220 short of where we need to be for the day to get our target, which is usually $600. We've got a lot of people on. Hopefully some of you can contribute. You can ask questions. Please, no questions for less than $20, even by you, Michael. Sorry. But just because we're just not going to have enough time to get to all the questions. So only questions are $20 and above, and ideally, if there are people out there that can contribute $50 or $100, that'd be great, and we can get to our targets very quickly. Let me also say that those of you who want to support the show on a monthly basis, you can do so on Patreon, Subscribestar, and the YaronBrookShow.com/support. All right, back to this. Back to me being upset at Joe Rogan and Jordan
Ford
Peterson.
did what you said that capitalists should do. I mean, when Ford was pressed on how much he paid his workers, because he paid them a lot, he said, I want to pay them enough so that they can afford a car. And so he ramped up wages dramatically. And that was
in order to attract the most productive people, because it was going to increase his profitability, right? Not because he wanted to sell another few thousand cars, although that was a plus.
partly part of his, you could say, self-interested vision, although I think that's an oversimplification.
Sure.
It's like, well,
is a
if we want to sell a
self-interested
product, why don't we expand the consumer market? Well, those people have to have some money.
Yeah.
That was Ford's notion.
But it wasn't his notion. It wasn't a notion of expanding the consumer market. I mean, think about the consumer market in the United States today. It has 350 million people, 320 million people, whatever. One company can't expand the consumer market by raising wages by itself. It's just again, bad economics.
When I was a kid, I had friends that had done gigs in Detroit when I was just starting out doing stand-up, and they were like, whatever you do, don't go to Detroit with a fucking Japanese car, because they will fuck your car up. I go, really? They go, yeah, these guys are auto workers. Like, they don't want to see foreign cars that they don't make in their city.
And that's not a good thing in a sense of the kind of violence that he's talking about. It's not a good thing. It's not something to celebrate. The fact that they would screw up your car if you
proud
win.
city that makes American cars. So like there was a thing.
Yeah, well, they were responding to a real threat. You were talking about old cars with me earlier. So one of my friends in the little town I grew up in, this was back in the mid-'70s, had a Dodge Colt, and it was one of the first Japanese cars. And that thing was a real piece of junk in a sea of pieces of junk, because cars in the mid-'70s, they were not good.
They fell apart.
They rusted
Particularly
fast,
American
but
cars.
nothing rusted
American cars
faster
were
than a
awful.
Japanese car in Canada. Those bloody things,
Yeah.
you could put them outside in the winter when there was salt in the road and watch them dissolve.
And then what happened?
What was very interesting
go.
about that, I saw this with the Chinese too, because in Alberta, I went to Edmonton, I think this would be 1975, about. It was the first Chinese trade fair in Canada. So they had Chinese manufactured implements at this display. It was really interesting because it was like walking back into 1945 or 1950. We looked at all these things and we thought, oh, that looks like exactly like what Grandpa was using on the farm, 40 years ago. So but with the Japanese, it's like their cars were junk to begin with. Yeah, to begin with. And then they got to be Toyota.
Yeah.
And
And then GM and Ford and Chrysler couldn't compete. So what, we should reward them for not competing? We should reward them for making bad cars? So we can keep the wages up by shutting down Japanese imports? Is that what Joe Rogan is arguing for? I think he is. But then you're rewarding incompetence. You're rewarding backwardness. You're rewarding lack of competition. And of course, the three big automobile companies were in bed with the American government during that period and shut down competition if it came from within the United States. Just watch the movie Tucker, which I think describes that phenomenon, at least in one case.
just think what Toyota did. You talked about how good cars are now.
Yeah.
Well, the net consequence of opening up that competition was...
And I wonder, if you open up that competition and cars got a lot better and a lot cheaper, did working class Americans benefit from that? Well, of course they did. But if you'd kept those cars out and we'd still to this day be driving American clunky, horrible, disgusting, awful, super expensive cars because they've never faced any competition, who would suffer primarily? The working class. I mean, free trade, shipping jobs overseas is good primarily for the working class. Primarily from the working class.
The Japanese got their act together, in the 80s particularly, Japan got so powerful that everyone thought it would be the dominant world economy
What
for
happened
like
to that?
10 years. And they just went from nothing after World War II to like superstars in 40 years. And it's really hard to see how that wasn't to everyone's benefit. Now, to your point, when you...
Adam Campbell says for $50 that he landed on Park Place and I had a hotel there. So thank you, Adam. That's the $50. Thank you for paying up. Those of you who land on my properties on the Monopoly board, the virtual, imaginary Monopoly board that we have right here, you should pay up like Adam did. He says, thanks for defending capitalism. It is my pleasure and honor.
You open up competition internationally, especially in manufacturing, you pose a tremendous threat to the current working class in your country, a tremendous immediate threat. It might be a long-term benefit because it stabilizes
He says it might be a long-term benefit because it stabilizes international relations. No! Yes! But also, more importantly, it's a long-term benefit because you get richer. Your working class gets richer. Richer in the sense of quality of life, of standard of living. Economics, guys. Economics.
Between countries that might otherwise go to war, in which case it would be working class people that would be being slaughtered like mad.
True,
but it's
but
no
not the
doubt
only
that,
reason.
To me, there's almost no doubt that the freeing of trade worldwide and the benefits that produced were paid for disproportionately by the American working class. And it also raises...
Just not true. None of that is true, guys.
There's another really complicated problem, which is when your economy switches to information and services, which is more complex cognitively to deliver. What do you do with people who would have been really good at working class jobs but aren't going to be good in a knowledge economy? And then,
isn't it amazing that in a knowledge economy, people can rise, people can get better. The children of auto workers in Detroit are programmers in Silicon Valley. This idea that you have some kind of fixed pool of IQ and that low IQ people can't do knowledge stuff is nonsense. It's just not true. Computers make all of us smarter. They make all of us more knowledgeable. Just like spell checkers make all of us good spellers, even people like me who can't spell. But more than that, right? It's just not true, again, that technology destroys jobs. And unfortunately, Jordan Peterson repeats that fallacy over and over and over again. It's not true that the working class pays for technological advance. technological advance makes all the products that they benefit, that they enjoy, that they consume cheaper and increases the standard of living. Let's see if there's anything
Answer
right
is,
at the end.
we don't know.
All right, that was it. All right. Let's stop there. We'll do some super chat. I don't know if I'm going to do this other Jordan Peterson clip. I was going to do Jordan Peterson's realization about the Bible clip. If I don't do it today, I'll do it in a future show. But let me take some super chat because we've got a lot of super chat questions. And then if we have time, we can do that clip. But it's a 5-minute clip, and 5 minutes typically takes me like 2 hours to go through, right? Let me encourage you guys to, where are we? We're at around $471. Hopefully we can get more, we can get up to the $600. Thank you again, Adam, for getting us closer. And all right, let's jump into some of the big super chat questions. Let's see if we have any $50 ones. And I'm hoping that some of these are on topic. John D says, all right, he says a non-Jordan Peterson, so I'm going to wait on that one because it's a non-Jordan Peterson. Okay. You know, I'm just going to jump in with these questions because I can't. All right. Okay, Darian asks, do you think the amount of information available to humans nowadays creates an effect of this know-it-all individual? For example, Peterson having the confidence to talk economics and physics as a professor of psychology. I don't think so. I think in the case of Peterson, it comes from the fact that he's super smart, that he has a certain structure to his ideas. And he's, in a sense, a system builder. He has kind of a system. Whether it's comprehensible or not is a question. But he certainly has a system involved. But he thinks that he can then take that system and apply it to any topic out there. I mean, you see this of other system builders who think that because they have knowledge that is meta knowledge, they can then, you know, derive all knowledge from that. And they ignore and they evade the specialized knowledge required in particular fields. I mean, I try not to talk about psychology, except in those areas where if somebody says something in psychology that contradicts what I know to be true, then I'll say that's not true. But I'm not going to try to articulate a whole psychological theory. I don't know psychology. So I don't think it's the amount of information. Quite the contrary, the amount of information should lead him to think the other way around. But I mean, I will say that I think it's super irresponsible. Because, and I think this is an important point, because we live in a society with a lot of information, huge amounts of information out there, where people are having a hard time keeping straight what is true and what is not, what is right and what is wrong, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what is even factual and what is not factual. The responsibility of the intellectuals is to sift through all the information and to provide individuals guidance about what is true and what is not. And Jordan does that in his field. And again, I disagree with him about a lot of things, so I'm not sure he does it well, but he does it in his field. And we need intellectuals to do it in a variety of different fields. That's what I try to do for you. Try to sift through the mountains of information and try to provide you with my interpretation of it, what I think is right, what I think is wrong, so that you don't have to do the sifting. And I expect you to challenge me. I expect you to think for yourself. I expect you not to blindly accept what I say. But hopefully what I'm doing is a service to you that way, at least for some things, on some issues, I can provide you with some, you don't have to watch and read and follow all this news because you wouldn't have time to do your job, to take care of your family, to do what you do on a day-to-day basis, to enjoy life, because you'd be bogged down doing my job, which is to sift through all the information and screen it for you. And when we as intellectuals don't do that well, when we as intellectuals present falsehoods to you as if they're true, go beyond the scope of our knowledge without telling you, look, I'm not an economist, but I often say, look, I'm not a philosopher, but I often tell you, I'm not good at this or at that. But Jordan Peterson doesn't say, look, I'm not an economist, but here's the truth about economics. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, I'm not an economist. He presents it as if it's fact. We can use physics to describe inequality. Just not true. So he's defaulting as on his responsibilities as an intellectual, in my view. Ali asks, isn't economy level 2 chaos system make it really hard to predict? That's from physics, by the way. I think someone should really question his assumptions of fact. Yes. I mean, you could argue that people have tried to apply chaos theory to economic prediction, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Because chaos theory, you can apply some mathematical equations to it. The economy, you cannot. People trade on chaos theory. It doesn't work consistently over time because human behavior is involved. Free will is involved. Human judgment and human values are involved. All right. Why do you think cities are built on entrepreneurship, capitalism, luck, trade, and innovation, but over time turn away from capitalism? The reason Chicago beat St. Louis and Indianapolis was because of the aspect above. Well, because they get rich and complacent. And because when these cities were built, it was a time of freedom and capitalism. It was a time when capitalism was prevalent. And what shapes history long-term are ideas. So at the time of the establishment of Chicago, at the time of the establishment of some of these other cities, the ideas of freedom, of individualism, of don't tread on me, on entrepreneurship, of trade, those were the ideas prevalent in the culture. By the time you start getting into the 20th century, those ideas are slowly being eroded. And since the cities are the intellectual hubs, the cities are where the intellectuals gravitate towards, the intellectuals have more impact on the city than on the rural areas where they don't live. The cities are where the universities are. The cities are where the schools are. The cities are where the intellectuals are, where the big newspapers are, where the big media is. So the impact of the intellectuals is going to be felt in the cities a lot before it's felt in the rest of the country. And as ideas changed through the 20th century and became more statist, more socialist, more collectivist, more welfarist, that came to dominate the cities because that's where the intellectuals were preaching these ideas, were teaching these ideas, were impacting the local politics with these ideas. Davian says, do you think people like Peterson feel they are the heroes of knowledge and must try and solve every trending problem? Yes, I think he does feel that way. I think it's him against the world to some extent. He's got a mission in life. He's got a meaning in his life. He finds meaning in trying to present what he views as the solution to all the world's problems. I think he's wrong. I think I have the solution to all the world's problems, not Jordan Peterson. But that's the conflict between us. And so far, he's winning more accolades than more followers than I am getting. Even though he's not qualified to speak on these issues, maybe feeling a hero becomes positive feedback. Yes. And we all suffer from that to some extent. I mean, I think I have the solution to all the world's problems. I really do. It's unbelievably frustrating that nobody listens. But, to me, and they listen to Jordan Peterson, because his solutions are not that out of the mainstream. They're not that radical. I'm much more radical than Jordan Peterson is on the key, fundamental, core issues. Objectivism is much more radical than Jordan Peterson is. Todd is leaving us for 3 weeks. Oh my God. I don't know how we're going to survive here, Todd, without you. Thank you. That $100 gets us almost to the $600 that we need. So come back quickly. 3 weeks. All right. So we'll see you again in mid to late February. I hope I hope you're not checking out because I said something. Just kidding. All right. Ashton asks, would you say that envy can be a good thing if it means you use it as a motivator to be competitive with those that you're envious of and want to be more successful? No, I don't think that's envy. I think that's jealousy. That's ambition. But envy is never a good thing, because envy, Ayn Rand defined envy as hatred of the good for being the good. It's very different than saying, I want a house as big as that, or I want to be that successful, or I want to be. But when the feeling is expressed as hatred, I don't like that person because he's successful. I don't like that person because he's got a bigger house than me. I don't like that person because he drives a nicer car than me. Then it's purely destructive, and you'll never be able to use it as true motivation. And if you do, even when you get the bigger house, even if you get more money, you'll never be happy. Because your motivation is second-handed, and your motivation, and not first-handed, not about you, and your motivation is to destroy, to bring him down. You'd be just as happy to tear him down than to raise yourself up. So envy is hatred. Envy is always bad, always evil, never a good motivation. Just call it ambition. And sometimes that ambition comes from a little competitive edge with other people, not because you envy them, but because you want to be as good as them. All right. Roland says that he's still in Catalonia, Spain, and nobody speaks Catalonian there. Everybody speaks Spanish, even though the sign's in Catalonian. Yes, I've been to Catalonia, and people do. Everybody speaks Spanish. Okay, John, $50. He says it's a non-Peterson question. New to objectivism, and I'm struggling with free will. Oh, God. Oh, God, only because this is not my realm. Biologically, neurons seem mechanical, too big for quantum effects. But introspection shows volition exists. Isn't someday we'll understand it a kind of mysticism? No. Any more than we know there's gravity. Do you understand gravity? Do we have a theory of gravity? Ryan, you're never too late. We don't have a theory or an understanding of gravity. We just know it's a force outlet. We understand how it works, but we don't know what it is in a deeper sense. Certainly Newton, maybe today, I don't know, maybe I don't know enough physics, right? Modern physics. I don't know, maybe some physicists says that. But Newton didn't understand the source of gravity. He didn't understand how gravity was caused by, I don't know, certain atom, whatever, right? But he knew it was a phenomenon, unequivocally, and he could calculate it, and he could do math about it, and he could make predictions about it. Same with consciousness. We don't understand the mechanics of it, if you will. But we know it exists. We know kind of how it works. We can see it in ourselves and to some extent in other people. We know it's important. It's the same thing, right? So, and think about a lot of phenomena in science where let me ask you this, do we understand life? We still haven't been able to create life in a laboratory. We don't quite understand how life came into being. We don't completely understand. We know it's a carbon phenomena, but we don't know what that means and how it's combined and what is life? And yet we know life exists. And we know there's a difference between things that are alive and things that are not alive, between a flower and a rock, even though we don't really understand the mechanism that makes a flower not a rock. And there are a million examples of that in science, where we understand some things and we don't understand everything. And we're still working for greater understanding of it. All right, we are short what? About $25. So, one $25 questions and we're there. I'd appreciate it. Don't forget to like the show before you leave. Don't forget to support it monthly on youronbookshow.com/support on Patreon. Only $20 questions. I'll only take $20 questions now, but I'm hoping we get some new people to ask some $20 questions or to support the show through the super chat. And let me see if there are any. Oh, there are a few more $20 questions. So let me do those first. Todd, Todd, you're back again already. Thank you for taking us over the edge. Now, the rest of the people are going to have to get us to the second target, which is 750. Once we make 600, we shoot for 750. So, I have time for more questions. Right? But if not, we can do the other Jordan Peterson video. But we still have a lot of questions here. Is it requirements for intellectual to complicate things up? Whenever I complain about me not understanding Jordan, people bring this up. No! I never had a problem with Ayn Rand or other philosophers. Well, some philosophers, try reading Immanuel Kant or even Adam Smith is hard to read. But that's not because Adam Smith has complicated things. It's just the way they express themselves. No, it is not a requirement. It's the opposite, I would argue. One of the requirements of an intellectual, requirements of being an intellectual, is to take very complex phenomena, to take very complex things and simplify them. I hope that's what I do. I strive to be an intellectual, and one of the things I try to do, right, is to take complicated ideas, abstract ideas, and simplify them. And that's a responsibility of intellectuals, and it's a shame when they don't do that. Let's see, James asked, does government and media make propel racism? So to get rid of it, we need more capitalism. Crime seems to increase when societies have less capitalism. How do we decrease crime or racism when people are not seen as individuals? So absolutely government and media propel racism, and critical race theory, I think, right now is propelling racism. I think Biden saying he is definitely going to nominate a black woman propels racism. Every time we talk and we discuss things about blacks do this, whites do that, greens do this, browns over there, propels racism. Affirmative action propels racism. Of course, racism was propelled by private individuals. It's why government propels it, because ultimately private individuals embrace racism. Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Private individuals propel racism. And that was John Crow. That was the South before the 1960s, and to some extent still in America today and across the world you have racism. So racism is not just a phenomenon of government. But one of the things that happens in capitalism is racism is defeated in capitalism. It's a losing strategy. Let's say law firms won't hire black lawyers. Well, then you hire black lawyers. And you can get them cheap because nobody else will hire them. So you can have the best law firm in the country because you're hiring people nobody else will hire and they're not hiring them for stupid reasons. So you can benefit enormously by hiring them. So capitalism is the way, one of the ways. It's not enough. You need ideas. Ideas are the ultimate way to deal with racism. You need the ideas of individualism. Right? But it's, yes, capitalism is required. The second part of your question, though, about crime, I mean, it's not clear the relationship between crime and capitalism. I mean, America has always been a relatively to other countries violent place, certainly relative to let's say post-World War II Europe. Individual violence has always been greater, seems to have always been greater in the United States than in Europe, even though the United States was more, quote, capitalist, more free than Europe was. I think if we attain real capitalism, and we appropriately went after criminals and penalized them and morally condemned them, and we didn't, waste the time police and our judiciary system, justice system, going after so-called victimless crimes, then yeah, I think crime would plummet in the United States. But at the end of the day, what matters both for crime and for all these other things is freedom. Is individualism. It's the idea of the value of individual. Capitalism being the political manifestation of that. So what we need is to teach people to be egoists, teach people to be individualists. Funnily enough, egoists don't commit crimes because self-interest, it's not in their self-interest to commit crimes. That's, if you want a society with no crime, that's what we need to be arguing for. And of course, once people are egoists, of course they'll be capitalists. What other economic system, what other political system would they embrace other than a system that recognizes their moral right to pursue their own interests based on their own judgment? Ryan asks, I really enjoyed your show on markets. Thanks. It hasn't got a lot of views. It's interesting kind of what gets views and what doesn't get views, right? My polemics get the most views. Like today's show will get a lot of views, partially because Jordan Peterson is in the title, but partially because polemics gets a lot more views. Polemics against the left primarily. Like polemics against Tucker Carlson doesn't do well. Just interesting in terms of the way what people watch. I find that all your shows are serving as a reminder for me to remember facts that I know, but that tend to slip my mind. Can you suggest a book on how government caused the Great Depression? There is a book by, and I can't remember the name of it, but you'll find it, by Folsom. Folsom, the same guy who wrote The Myth of the Robber Barons. He has one on the Great Depression. Who else has books on the Great Depression? Amity Schley has a book on the Great Depression that I think also shows how government programs made the Great Depression a Great Depression and made it worse, not better. FDR made it worse, not better. Amity Schley's, again, I forget the name of the book, but if you just look her up, you'll find it. Milton Friedman has a big tome on the history of interest rates in the United States, which makes the case that the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression. But that's too big of a tome to actually read. What else? There are a bunch of books like that. I'll make a note and try to look for, give you a list of those kind of books. I always promise. I'll have to go through my FDR's Folly. Yes, FDR's Folly is one of those books. But I'm trying to think of a good. Mises makes the case. Mises makes the case. I can't remember if Hayek makes the case, but certainly Mises makes the case. There's a lot written. The Forgotten Man is Amity Schley's book. Thank you. The Forgotten Man. Thank you, Scott. There's a lot written among the Austrian economists about the causes of the Great Depression. I think Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, I can't remember if directly makes the case or indirectly makes the case, but certainly Henry Hazlitt has a book. There's a lot out there on the Great Depression from a free market perspective that makes the case that government caused the Great Depression. OMG Papiche says, good show. I like Rogan, but he is naive in ways you describe. Poor Spotify. They are caught in the crossfire now over this censorship nonsense. There's no censorship here. We all make choices. We get to choose. We can't listen to everybody. We don't have to carry everybody. We get choices in who we carry and who we don't. Everybody has a legitimate right to do that. And Spotify has a right to do it, but so does Twitter, and so does Facebook. And you don't lose that right to discriminate against just because the other party is a politician or even the president. All right, Ashton asks, how do you fight depression? Through your philosophy of objectivism, how do you get yourself motivated? Well, first, depression is a psychological phenomena. Philosophy obviously can help, but you've got to deal with it psychologically. So you got to see, I think if it's a serious case of depression, you've got to see a therapist. And I would suggest a cognitive therapist, somebody who values the human mind. It's hard to find good therapists, but you got to look for a good therapist. I've had Gina Gorlin, who's a therapist, on here, and some of you I know have used her services. She's very good. You don't solve a psychological problem with philosophy or philosophical problems with psychology. They are distinct realms that are related, but they're not interchangeable, right? You get motivated by getting yourself motivated, by identifying your values, by reminding yourself why those values are values and why those values are crucial to your life and crucial to your happiness, and why happiness and life are good, and you drive yourself towards that. Whew, okay. Oh, Ashton has another $20 question that I missed before. What would you rate Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto out of 5 stars? 5.5. 25 stars out of 5. It's brilliant. It's a work of genius, and one of the most important works you'll ever read, because it's the kind of work where the conclusions from it you can implement in your life. It's not like politics where, God help us. You can change your life. You can make your life better just by reading that book and then acting on it. Thinking, internalizing, and acting on it. All right, we got a bunch of like $10 questions. We're going to run through these quickly, and then we'll call it a day, and I'll go get my dinner. Of course, if you have more questions, you can ask them, but make them, juicy dollar-wise. Thanks for covering more economic stuff lately. I know you mentioned Economics in One Lesson, and you mentioned von Mises' books. What econ books do you recommend? Well, von Mises and Economics in One Lesson. Others by Hazlitt. Yesterday, I recommended Capitalism by George Reisman, but it's a massive book, and I recommend it as a textbook more than anything else. I also recommend Julian Simon as an economist and his writings. I recommend, if you're really studying economics, I've got all of von Bavinck and Menger, who are the other big Austrian names at the foundations of Austrian economics. Then Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman have good books, although, again, I don't think they're quite right. I've recommended the blogs of Tyler Cowen and the blog of John Cochrane as good sources on economics, and other things. There are a lot of good economic books out there. Again, none of them is perfect. None of them explains everything, but you can learn a lot from a lot of different people. Matthew also asked, Jordan normally cites something called the Matthew Principle, price laws, and Pareto distribution. Any insight of these? Yeah, Pareto distribution is a principle in economics that says that markets reach a certain equilibrium in which the distribution of goods and wealth is optimal. It's the best that can be achieved. It's a useful concept. It's too static. Austrians generally don't go for these kind of equilibrium models. So it's not an ideal. I don't know what he means by price laws, and I don't know the Matthews Principle. But, to the extent that prices convey crucial information. Prices are super important. When you distort prices, when you pervert prices, you get misallocation of capital, misallocation of resources, misallocation of labor. You get an entire distorted economy. So prices are crucial, and prices need freedom to reflect the information properly. And there's a whole theory on why that is. And when you have a Fed, you distort prices. When you regulate, you distort prices. And all of that has real implications in the real economy. All right, guys, we're at $706. We could make it to $750. One of you guys can do $50, and we're there. And that'll make it a really, really successful day and an amazing month. It'll be an amazing month. All right, Gail says, please repeat your phrases about how prosperous nations contribute to world peace. I cannot find it to share word for word. It was excellent. I cannot do that. I certainly not word for word. And I'm not going to repeat it here, but it was either yesterday's show or the day before that. How about this? Action Jackson, if you're watching or if you're going to watch this, please make that a short video, maybe even a 1-minute video. Take everything I said about how prosperity and how markets and how freedom contribute to world peace and how trade contributes to world peace. There was like a little monologue I did either yesterday or the show before that. And Gail, if you know exactly what show it is, let me know. And Action Jackson will find it and he'll make a video of it because I think it was good and I think it deserves its own video. So please do that. Okay, John asks, would you debate Nick Fuentes? No. He has a huge following. I don't care. And said that he would only vote for Trump or Tucker, who are two of your favorite people for president. Will you reach out to him for a debate? Absolutely not. Nick Fuentes is what I would technically call a scumbag. Action Jackson, no, it's not in this show. It was either in last show or the show before that. I did this rant about why freedom and peace go together. It wasn't in this show. It was a question by Thomas Schubert. So, Thomas, was it yesterday or the day or the show before that? If you can remember, put it in the chat. So, no, Nick Fuentes is a racist, anti-Semite. I will not debate racists. I will not debate anti-Semites. And he is a scumbag. He is a horrible, evil human being. The fact that he would vote for Trump or Tucker is irrelevant. I know a lot of people who are basically good people who would vote, or great people who would vote for Trump. But again, no. There's certain level of lowness that I will not debate. There's certain people on the left I won't debate because of that. And suddenly the whole Nick Fuentes, Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor are evil human beings, and I will not debate any one of them. They're not worthy of my stepping on stage with them or my being on Zoom with them. Action Jackson, it was on yesterday's show. Aviram says, what forms of fascism are to be expected as a consequence of the corona lockdowns precedent? Well, I think more control over human behavior, particularly as it relates to climate change. I think what you can expect is more attempts to regulate what we do, when we do it, how we do it, more movement towards what the Chinese call the social score. How good a citizen are you? How are you protecting the environment? What is your carbon score? What's your carbon credit? So much more involvement in the particulars of human life. ESG is a form of fascism. It's a form of using these things in order to control corporate behavior. So first I'll go for the corporations, then they'll go for us as individuals because they know corporations are an easier target. So much more detailed level involvement and regulation of individual behavior, starting at the corporate level and then at the individual level. Let's see. Bradley says, don't you think it's mostly evasion, this interview? Both men are very public figures, especially in working class male circles. Doesn't a man braver than his brother insults them with implications? Tui, ring true here. I'll quote Tui again. A man braver than his brother's insults them by implication. Certainly it's evasion, but I don't think it's evasion. I don't think it's evasion motivated by the fact that their audience is working class. I don't think it's that. I think it's evasion, much deeper evasion. Look, I think Joe Rogan's basically ignorant. I don't think he knows anything, or in economics, in politics, in culture. I mean, he's a comedian with a background in martial arts, and he's funny, and he asks a lot of good questions. He has people on his show from the entire spectrum. He latches on in terms of the ideology of the people, to those people who present a simplistic, not overly controversial in terms of ethical and moral principles view of the world. So he's conventional. What I consider Joe Rogan conventional. The nice thing is that he's willing to hear voices from outside the mainstream. But if the voices from outside the mainstream are too radical, philosophically he won't have somebody like me on, doesn't look like. He'll have somebody like Malone on because it fits a certain anti-establishment, thing that he has. It also is a slap in the face to the irrational establishment views on COVID, right? So in a sense, what he's doing is good. But he's mostly ignorant. Jordan has constructed such a floating, intricate, sophisticated, but wrong system of thought that he can't think right about stuff. He can't conceptualize it right because he has built a conceptual faculty for a particular purpose, a Platonic purpose, a purpose devoid ultimately from reality, from empirical reality. He is very much, at the end of the day, a kind of a Kantian and a Platonist. He's very much stuck, and he says this in some of his videos in a sense. He's inside a box, and that box is created by his concepts. Because concepts are not a phenomena of abstraction from reality, from perception, but are imposed from above. You could argue from the Bible, from archetypes, from the world of forms. You're stuck with them. They're not then as useful, and they don't make it possible for you to think outside of the box and to discover new knowledge quite in the same way, because it has to fit within this. He's a rationalist, but in an objectivist terminology. Right. So I think Joe Rogan, while he gives a platform, and I commend Joe Rogan. He's obviously unbelievably successful. Good for him. I celebrate success. He appeals to something real in people. He gives a platform to a wide variety of people, but he tends to agree with the wrong people. He tends to agree with Bernie Sanders. His interview with Bernie Sanders was disgusting. He tends to agree with people like Dr. Malone because it fits into his anti-conventional, his snubbing at the establishment. But there's a real deep ignorance there, and there's certainly a deep conventionality philosophically, and ignorance of whole fields within human endeavor. That's just a reality. It's not me trying to insult him or saying anything bad about him, because I admire him. I admire his success. Oh God, look, Catherine herself. Wow. Catherine herself is getting us to $750. She is making a contribution to Your Own Book Show. This should shame all of you. Her job is to get you to contribute, and here she is contributing. So thank you, Catherine. She says, do you still officiate people? How much do you charge? Do I still officiate over weddings? Yes, I do. I don't know. I mean, if you're interested, it depends on where it is, when it is, how difficult it is to get there, all of that stuff. So it's a very variable number. But if you're interested in getting information how much I charge to officiate over a wedding, then contact me at youraownbookshow.com. Happy to discuss that, right? To discuss that. And happy to hear, I mean, I don't know if you're getting married, but if you are, happy to hear that you're getting married. That's exciting. All right, 3 questions. Robert says, must run, prepping to go live at the top of the hour. Wow, this is like a day of objectivists doing shows. This is ridiculous. Thomas, thank you for the $20. He says, can't think of a good question, but thank you for the $20. He says, great show as always. We'll listen to the rest of the Super Chat, AMA, Q&As afterwards. Robert and Amy. Nay, sir. Nay, sir. Nay, sir. Nay, sir. I'll keep saying it. One day it'll stick. It'll stick. Every time you write me a Q&A, put nay, sir at the end of it, and ultimately my thick skull will absorb it. Michael says, seems leftists only like the Bill of Rights when it helps criminals. I mean, leftists used to like the Bill of Rights when it protected freedom of speech and separation of church and state, and when they could find a right to abortion in it. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, leftists don't believe in free speech anymore, unfortunately. Or some leftists don't, anyway. Michael asks, the systems ineffective by their nature. Time is not a friend of totalitarian systems. That's right. Totalitarian systems collapse upon themselves, particularly when there's an alternative out there that is evident. Right? All right, we made it. 2 hours and 3 minutes. I started a little late, so 2 hours. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the support. We got to $770 today, which is fantastic. It makes this month the third best month we've ever had on Super Chat. So thank you, everybody, for the support. Thank you for making it possible. Don't forget to like the show before you leave. Don't forget to share, particularly those 1 minute videos. Those 1 minute videos are doing really, really well. So don't forget to share those. And of course, as I've often said, I know there are many of you out there who listen and get value out of this. It would be great if you showed value in return, value for value, trader principle, by providing a monthly contribution to Iran Book Show to make it possible for me to do all these things, to be the champion of capitalism. And you can do that on iranbookshow.com/support, on Patreon, on Subscribestar, on Locals. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Bye, everybody. See you then.